Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the most obscure, whispered about elements in the entire Warhammer 40k mythos. Something so ancient and buried, even the Inquisition doesn't like to mention it aloud. I'm talking about the Last Church, or more precisely, what may have come after it. We all know the Imperium crushed every trace of religion that stood before the Emperor's truth. But what if something survived? What if, hidden beneath the rubble of burned cathedrals and purged scrolls, there are still watchers? Still eyes? This isn't just another lost sect or forgotten cult. The idea we're about to explore is far more unsettling. There are fragments, barely connected accounts, and shrouded theories suggesting that before the Age of Imperium fully dawned, when the Emperor still walked among mortals, there were individuals who didn't go down screaming or praying. They vanished. And ever since, there have been those who claim that something still watches, that a thread of that ancient faith never snapped, it just retreated underground. And what if that thread still pulses with life? Most people shrug this off, just ghost stories told by rogue historians or psychers too deep in the warp. But the more you look, the harder it is to ignore the patterns. Unusual disappearances, sites no one wants to investigate, words redacted from even pre-imperial texts, and always, this phrase that lingers like a toxin, the eyes of the Last Church. So let's go deep, into ruins, into myths, into the cracks of recorded history. Because if the Last Church did leave something behind, it wasn't relics. It was a network, a presence, eyes that never closed. Before the Emperor declared the imperial truth and began his crusade against superstition, Terra was an entirely different place. It wasn't just a world of broken nations and warring techno-barbarian tribes. It was a planet still deeply tangled in faith. Old, fragmented, and contradictory faiths, yes, but still powerful in their grip on the human soul. You didn't just survive in that age with a gun or a bunker. You survived with belief, with something to hold on to while everything else crumbled. The Last Church. That name alone stirs something in the imagination. It wasn't its real name, of course. That was a label placed on it after its end, in bitter irony. We don't know what they called themselves, not exactly. Some sources suggest it was a syncretic religion, cobbled together from the husks of countless older creeds that had managed to endure the long night of old Earth's collapse. Others believe it was a restorationist movement, trying to recreate a mythic golden age of spiritual unity that never truly existed. What matters, though, is that it endured long after most other religions had faded, burned, or been drowned in oceans of blood and data. From what scattered fragments we have, often pieced together from hidden repositories, forbidden writings, and oral echoes passed down by rebels and archivists, it seems the Last Church wasn't just a place. It was a movement, a holdout, a final bastion of the old world's soul in a time when the flesh had taken over. Its priests weren't just preachers. They were custodians of memory, guardians of something sacred in a world that had forgotten what sacred even meant. They operated from hidden sanctuaries, stone halls carved into mountainsides, deep temples under shattered metropolises, sanctified spaces rebuilt in the rubble of atomized cities. Their rituals were quiet, symbolic, deeply personal. They didn't command armies or move nations, not anymore. But they offered something that no warlord or technocrat could. Meaning, a reason to believe there was more than just survival. And people came to them. Broken people, curious people, desperate people. The Last Church provided more than liturgy. It provided continuity, a whisper of something eternal. While the world around them embraced transhumanism, AI remnants, and brutal martial faiths that worshipped power, the Last Church seemed to resist. It stood against the storm, not with weapons, but with silence, patience, and prayer. Some fan theories suggest that the Church actually maintained more influence than historians admit. That they weren't merely isolated cells, but part of a loosely interconnected order that stretched across Terra and beyond, into the scattered void stations of dying colonies. That they had their own methods of communication, their own rites of secrecy. That they may have even had their own version of psychers, people touched not by the warp in the way navigators or astropaths are, but by something subtler, a sense of presence, of intuition, of knowing. What's also fascinating is the sheer variety of beliefs that may have been housed under the umbrella of the Last Church. From pre-unity monotheists and post-industrial pantheons to nature cults and spiritual technologists, all supposedly bound together not by dogma, but by a shared refusal to kneel to the machine or the man. That's a powerful idea, and one that resonates with many fans who feel like the grim darkness of the far future sometimes lacks soul. There's also the lingering theory, one that comes up a lot in the deeper lore circles, that the last church wasn't merely tolerated for a time, but secretly respected by the Emperor himself. That he didn't immediately burn it from the earth because it served as a kind of mirror. A final reminder of what humanity used to believe in before he rewrote the meaning of truth. Maybe he wanted it gone only once he was certain that no one else would need it anymore. Or maybe, just maybe, he feared it. And if that's true, if the last church did carry something the Emperor couldn't fully extinguish, then maybe, just maybe, what they left behind wasn't just a whisper. Maybe it was a watchful eye, something that saw what came next and refused to close. The story of the last church doesn't end with a slow fade into obscurity. It ends in fire. When the Emperor finally made his move to unite Terra and erase the old world, the faiths that had endured the long centuries of collapse were not spared. In fact, they were among the first to go. The imperial truth wasn't just a philosophical position, it was a weapon. A doctrine of pure reason wielded with surgical precision to exterminate every trace of irrationality. And to the Emperor, belief in gods, in spirits, in anything beyond the material, that was the ultimate irrationality. The Purge of the last church wasn't a grand battle. There were no armies clashing on sacred ground, no temples turned into last stands. That's what makes it so chilling. It was quiet, surgical, efficient. Entire congregations simply vanished. Records were erased so thoroughly that even the dates are debated. Some say it happened during the Unification Wars. Others argue that the true purging came later, once the Emperor had full control, and could sweep away what little had been allowed to remain during the chaos. One of the most discussed events among lore enthusiasts is the tale of the final dialogue, a supposedly apocryphal account of a conversation between the Emperor himself and the last priest of the last church. Whether it really happened or not almost doesn't matter anymore. In this story, the priest does not argue, does not beg, does not fight. He simply tries to understand. And the Emperor, in return, shows something rare. Patience. Even sadness. It's one of the few times we ever see him portrayed not as a conqueror, but as a man burdened by what he must destroy. And then, the church burns. But that story is clean. Too clean. It wraps the end of faith in a tidy narrative bow as if to soothe us. In truth, the destruction was likely far more brutal and far less symbolic. Temples were torn down, relics shattered, priests hunted, interrogated, and executed, often without trial. Those who resisted were labeled anarchs, psychers, heretics. And those who didn't resist? They disappeared anyway. Because it wasn't about punishment, it was about erasure, about ensuring that nothing, not even a whispered prayer, could remain to challenge the new reality being imposed. Still, even in the age of total information control, rumors slipped through. Scattered accounts of congregations vanishing into the tunnels beneath ancient cities, of sacred texts hidden in vaults that refused to open, of individuals who, under pressure, claimed to have seen priests flee not in fear, but in silence, like they were following a plan. Some fans believed there were survivors, not just a handful of refugees, but a coordinated exodus. That as the Emperor's forces closed in, key figures of the last church enacted a centuries-old contingency, that they'd always known this day would come, and had long prepared for it. There's a theory that within the catacombs beneath old Earth, there are hidden chapels still untouched. Not ruins, active sanctuaries. Sealed, preserved, waiting. Others speculate that the priests who escaped didn't just go into hiding, they became something else entirely, that they abandoned their titles, their rituals, their robes, but not their mission. That they became observers, watchers. They didn't resist the end of their church because they believed something more important than the church itself needed to survive. Memory. Truth. Presence. One unsettling story that gets brought up in fan circles involves a Mechanicus exploratory team, centuries later, uncovering a pre-imperial structure deep beneath the Martian crust. Inside, untouched air, intact furnishings, and frescoes depicting human figures with halos of flame. No data files, no machines, just a single phrase etched into the wall in ancient Low Gothic, "We saw." Of course, the Mechanicus disavowed the report, claimed the site was misinterpreted. But the logs leaked, and once they did, speculation exploded. The erasure of the last church wasn't just a historical footnote, it was an existential cleansing. It was a war against memory. And yet, the shadows it left behind remained strangely long, even millennia later. If no one survived, then who keeps whispering? If all was destroyed, then what are these fragments we keep finding? It's that uncertainty, the gap between what we're told and what we feel, that keeps the legend alive. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, even a myth can be dangerous, especially one that might still be watching. The strangest part about the purging of the last church isn't the fire, it's the silence. Not the silence of prayers cut short or hymns unsung, but the eerie silence that followed. When the flames died down and the temples returned to rubble, there should have been bodies, executions, trials, lists, names. But there weren't. Not really. What we find instead, in the few obscure references that survive, is something far more chilling, an absence that's too perfect. As if the priests and high clergy didn't die, they vanished. That's what always gets me. It's not that they were wiped out, it's that they left so little behind. Too little. Some say it's because the imperial truth was just that effective. Total erasure, complete systemic deletion of every record, every lineage, every mention. But others, myself included, have a hard time buying that, especially when whispers still surface, names that don't appear in any official registry, symbols carved where no one should have been. The same phrases turning up in different sectors, spoken in different tongues, with eerie consistency. There's a theory that the upper clergy, the true spiritual leaders of the last church, saw what was coming long before the first temple burned. That they had watched the rise of the emperor not with fear, but with something closer to acceptance. That they knew the age of open worship was over, and that survival wouldn't be found in resistance, but in disappearance. And that's exactly what they did. They disappeared. Not as fugitives, not in panic, but with purpose. Whole groups, entire lineages of priests simply dropped off the grid, their names erased from sacred registries, their identities buried. Some believe they altered their genetic profiles, underwent surgery, adopted new roles across Terra and the early Imperium. That they became technocrats, workers, scribes, even administratum clerks, anything but what they had been. Anything but priests. There's this old data fragment that's often cited in these circles. It's a recovered Vox recording from a forgotten archive on Luna. Cracked and mostly illegible, but one line plays clear. A voice, weary but calm, saying, "Faith must wear many faces. Today mine is silence." That line haunts me, because it doesn't sound like defeat. It sounds like a vow. Other stories speak of them forming what amounts to a counter-order. Not a church anymore, but a scattered network of individuals. No hierarchy, no robes, no dogma, just memory. They remember what the last church stood for, and that memory, they believe, is enough. Enough to pass on in secret, enough to protect even if no one knows it exists. It's said they taught their children not to pray, but to listen. Not to build altars, but to watch. And that each generation took on a different mask, slipping deeper into the folds of imperial society until no one could tell them apart from the rest of us. One of the more extreme theories, admittedly speculative, is that some of them were psychers, latent ones, subtle ones, undetected by the early black ships. That they had psychic means of hiding themselves and others. That they formed what could only be called a psychic cloister, shielding not just their bodies, but their very presence from those who sought them. It sounds wild, but there are documented anomalies. Individuals arrested for heretical speech who, under interrogation, recited prayers not found in any known religious archive. Phrases echoing liturgies of the last church, prayers no one should still know. There's even a belief among some fan circles that the Watchers, those so-called eyes of the last church, aren't a myth, but the priesthood itself, transformed. That instead of shepherding flocks, they turned their attention outward, becoming chroniclers, observers, and yes, maybe even manipulators. That their aim was never revenge or revival, but remembrance. To ensure that something of the old soul of humanity lived on, even in the shadow of an empire that denied it ever existed. I keep thinking about what it would mean if even a handful of them survived. not to wage war or preach in the open, but simply to exist, to move through the halls of power with quiet eyes, never revealing what they truly are. That kind of survival isn't just cunning, it's devotion. It's the ultimate form of faith. Faith in the long game. Faith in memory. Faith that one day, someone would start asking the right questions again. Maybe someone like us. This is where things start getting truly weird. Up to this point, we can at least pretend we're talking about hidden history, suppressed archives, forgotten priests. But when we talk about the eyes of the last church, we're diving headfirst into pure speculation, yet the kind that sticks with you. There's no official record, no sanctioned lore, but the phrase keeps showing up. Not in the texts of the Imperium, but in whispers, in redacted reports, in wild theories shared between fanatics and truth seekers. And once you notice it, it becomes impossible to unsee. The first time I saw the phrase was in a footnote, buried in a transcript from a declassified interrogation of a rogue archaeotechnologist. The prisoner had apparently uncovered sealed architecture beneath the ruins of pre-imperial temples, and when pressed, mentioned eyes in the stone that never blink. That phrase alone is eerie, but what really makes your skin crawl is how often similar language shows up in completely unrelated places. Explorator logs, shipboard graffiti, scratched into the frame of an abandoned pick slate recovered from a warp ghost ship. Always variations on the same idea, something or someone watching, quietly, permanently. So who or what are the eyes? No one agrees. Some argue the term was symbolic, that the last priests or their successors trained individuals to act as passive observers. Not spies exactly, and not warriors, just people placed in key areas to do nothing but witness. The theory goes that the eyes were there to ensure the truth of events, real truth, would not be lost to imperial propaganda. That somewhere, in some sealed archive or hidden soul, the real history of humanity is still being recorded. Not for power, not even for resistance, but for the sake of remembrance. Others think it's more literal, that the eyes are a group, a surviving cell of the last church's clergy or descendants who preserved the church's sacred task by turning themselves into a clandestine order. They abandoned worship because worship draws attention. But watching? That's quiet, that's survivable, that's eternal. This version of the story paints the eyes as ghost archivists, an order with no temple, no voice, just vision. One popular fan theory builds on this and adds a layer of creepy mysticism. It claims the eyes aren't just metaphorical observers but possess actual abilities, like low-level precognition or sensory extension. They supposedly trained in meditative disciplines so ancient they predate even recorded Terran religions, allowing them to see without seeing. That's how they evade detection. That's how they still walk the halls of forbidden knowledge, unnoticed even by the Inquisition. There's also the idea that the eyes were chosen, not born. That when the last church realized its days were numbered, it selected individuals from across Terra, men and women from all walks of life, and entrusted them with sacred insight. Each given a piece of a prophecy, each scattered to different corners of the world, and they never spoke of what they held. Their mission wasn't to stop the fall of faith, but to prepare for something beyond it, to be present when the time was right. Some fans even draw connections between these supposed eyes and the scattered apocalyptic prophecies recorded in Rogue Libraria, visions of a future where truth would burn brighter than any star. Another curious angle that comes up often is the linguistic thread. That the term Eyes of the Last Church itself only appears in fragmented form because it's been translated, mistranslated, and whispered through so many layers of obfuscation. One archivist in the fringe circles of Terran lore insists the original term was Yuncti Oculi, loosely joined eyes, which could suggest not individual watchers but a collective perception, many minds forming one view, like a hive of remembrance. It's unsettling stuff, especially when paired with the theory that this network still exists, using ancient psionic channels or even pre-imperial data relays to share what they see. But for every theory, there's a counter-argument. That it's all a myth, that the eyes are just a narrative comfort, a way for romantics and heretics to believe that not everything pure was lost in fire. And honestly, that's what makes it so compelling. Because whether they're real or not, the eyes have become more than a legend. They're a symbol. A a counterbalance to the Imperium's absolute control over narrative. A reminder that maybe, just maybe, someone still remembers how things really were. And isn't that a kind of power on its own? Every time someone rediscovers that phrase, every time a new theory bubbles up from the deep web of lore fans, it's like they've tapped into something larger than themselves. Not a conspiracy, not a rebellion, just a pair of eyes. Watching, waiting, and that idea that somewhere in the dark there's still someone who sees, it's terrifying, and somehow, deeply hopeful. Let's talk about the ruins, because for all the speculation about hidden priests and living memory, it's the physical traces, the actual bones of the last church, that really get under your skin. Not just because they still exist, but because some of them shouldn't. Some structures have survived for tens of thousands of years in places where even FaithCreate melts under the weight of time and war. These aren't just ancient buildings, they're anomalies. And in a universe where the Imperium prides itself on total annihilation of heretical architecture, the fact that any of these ruins still stand is suspicious. Most of the known remains are buried deep beneath the crust of old Earth. Not the surface ruins that have become hollow tourist facades or sealed administratum vaults, but the layers no one dares dig into anymore. Sublevels so far below the modern hive foundations that even the Mechanicus considers them non-essential. Which, let's be honest, is code for, we're scared of what's down there. Some of these structures are shaped unlike anything else on Terra. Domes without entryways, spires that continue underground, deeper than scanners can map. Walls with inscriptions that refuse to be translated, not because they're encrypted, but because they change. Slightly, subtly, as if they don't want to be understood. One of the more infamous cases is the Sanctuary of the Hollow Echo. It's not marked on any modern map. The name comes from a rogue archaeohistorian who supposedly found it beneath the ruins of old Jakarta. He claimed it was a circular structure of smooth obsidian stone, with no lights, no power, no doors, just a single passageway leading down into silence. He described hearing sounds that weren't there, whispers without source, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. The man published fragments of his findings on a restricted data net before vanishing. And I don't mean he deleted his account. I mean he vanished. No trace, like he never existed. There are dozens of similar stories. Unexplained sensor blackouts during excavation operations, Vox interference centered on certain sites, reports of construction servitors going berserk near unregistered ruins. Always the same pattern. Imperial authorities dismissing it, sealing the area, sometimes even glassing it from orbit if things get out of hand. But why? If the ruins are truly dead, what's the danger in examining them? Some fans believe that these locations weren't just churches, they were nodes, connected parts of a larger structure, maybe not physically, but spiritually or psionically. That the last church, in its final days, transformed its architecture into a kind of network, not just places of worship, but listening stations. Beacons, observatories not aimed at the stars, but at us. Not for control, but for continuity. Like seeds waiting to be activated. The theory goes that when the Emperor began his purge, the leaders of the church scattered, yes, but they didn't leave their sanctuaries empty. They encoded memories into the walls, into relics, into the very foundation stones. It sounds ridiculous, until you read about the subvault in the Himalaysian plateau, where a Mechanicus team found an active power source buried beneath a ruin that predated the dark age of technology. The power signature didn't match anything known. It pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat. The team was ordered to leave immediately. The site has been sealed ever since. Even more unsettling are the rumors of gatherings. Not just ancient ruins, but active meeting points. Witness reports from hive underworlds speak of cloaked figures slipping into closed chambers and never coming out. Of low hymns echoing through ventilation shafts. Of children born with memories they shouldn't have. Some claim these meetings are rituals. Others think they're simply conversations. Exchanges of information between people who remember a different version of history, or who never forgot. There's also the persistent idea that some of these ruins are reactive, that they only respond to certain people. Maybe genetic markers, maybe psychic presence, maybe something stranger. That's why most explorers find nothing, just stone and dust. But the right person? They find lights, open doors, voices. It's not about the structures themselves. It's what they suggest, that the last church never truly ended, that it buried itself in the bones of Terra and maybe other worlds too, that it built a message into the foundation of civilization and trusted that one day someone would know how to read it. To me, that's scarier than any daemon or Xenos, because daemons scream and consume. But this waits, it watches, and it never moves, because it doesn't have to. It already knows that one day we'll come back, not out of faith, but out of curiosity. And then, whatever it is, we'll be ready. If the ruins are still standing, then someone's maintaining them. That's the line that always sticks with me when we talk about these supposed remnants of the last church. Because ruins don't persist like this in the Imperium, not without a reason. The Imperium is many things, but tolerant of the unknown isn't one of them. So when you find remnants of sacred spaces that haven't just survived but feel preserved, you start to wonder if someone's out there, walking quietly in their shadow. There's a difference between abandoned architecture and something that feels like it's waiting. You can sense it in the reports. Those unofficial, unverifiable logs smuggled out of excavation teams, stories from underhivers and scavvers who stumble across stone too smooth, too deliberate. A sealed chamber with unmarked walls, air too fresh for the depths it's buried in. In some cases, there's warmth. In others, a soft vibration, like something humming just out of hearing range. And in more than one account, there's the sense that they were not alone. Not threatened exactly, just watched. A lot of these so-called sightings come from places long written off by the administratum as structurally unstable or spiritually tainted. Old zones where the ecclesiarchy or the Inquisition refuses to build, citing atmospheric anomalies or unexplained resistance in the stone. But even in those reports, if you read between the lines, there's an almost respectful hesitation. Like they're not just avoiding danger, they're avoiding awakening something. Take the Selenic depths, for instance. A region of subterranean ruins beneath what used to be a Terran coastal megalopolis. Deep, uncharted tunnels laced with remnants of ceramic altars and circular mosaics inlaid with unknown alloys. Imperial records mark the place as uninhabitable due to resonant instability. Yet every few decades, Vox signals start bleeding up from beneath the stone. Not structured broadcasts, nothing anyone can decrypt, just patterns, rhythmic, almost musical pulses. And then silence. The fan theory that gets thrown around a lot is that what we're seeing isn't random, that these ruins are nodes of an active network, not in the sense of cogitators or data relays, but something older, more esoteric, that the last church prepared for its annihilation by embedding itself into the world, not just physically, but through space and behavior. A decentralized model of continued presence. No hierarchy, no communication in the conventional sense. Just structures that act as hubs for individuals who already know how to interpret the signs. You see this pop up in strange ways. Reports of wandering pilgrims with no known point of origin who always seem to arrive at the right time. Civilians found kneeling in forgotten places, whispering prayers no longer taught. Even a case where a mid-level imperial functionary inexplicably traced an exact symbol of the last church onto a data slate during routine notation, then had no memory of doing it. Some believe these structures don't just host secret gatherings, they shape them, that they draw people in. Not overtly, not through invitation, but through resonance. That the people who gather there don't plan to meet, they're guided to. Drawn by dreams, strange impulses, or what they think is intuition. And when they arrive, they don't always know what to say. They just know not to speak too loudly. There's also a darker layer to all this. A growing number of voices in the community who think these places aren't just points of worship or memory, but sanctuaries of dangerous knowledge. Not heretical, not in the way the Imperium frames it, but incompatible. That within these ruins lie records or fragments of thought too pure, too preserved to survive in the modern Imperium. And if that's true, it would make sense why these places are hidden so well. Why those who find them either vanish or return changed. What really haunts me, though, are the theories that say the ruins themselves learn, that they observe, that the eyes of the last church aren't just people, but systems, spaces, machines built of stone and silence, that every time someone enters a sacred ruin, the place remembers, adapts, prepares. It's hard not to get lost in the implications. Because if even one of these theories is true, then the last church didn't just survive. It evolved. It became something the emperor might never have foreseen. Not a structure, not even a faith, but an echo that moves underground in the cracks of civilization, quietly rewriting what it means to be remembered. And somehow, still watching. There's always been this shadowy layer to the legend of the eyes that doesn't get talked about enough. Because once you bring psychers into the conversation, everything gets 10 times more complicated and 100 times more dangerous. But if we're really asking how a network of watchers could survive the most intense cultural purge in human history, the psychic angle makes a disturbing amount of sense. Not just because of their abilities, but because psychers can do something no other agents can. They can feel the truth across time, across distance, maybe even across death. What if the eyes weren't just observers in the physical sense? What if their role was to see what others couldn't? Subtle fluctuations in thought, memory, spiritual resonance. The kind of things no servo-skull or data scryer could ever detect. In a galaxy where the warp is the ultimate source of both truth and corruption, maybe the last church found a way to work with that boundary. Not to summon daemons or delve into heresy, but to open their perception just enough to witness what the Imperium sought to erase. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. We know that during the dark age of technology, psychic sensitivity was not only present, it was cultivated. And by the time the age of strife hit, unregulated psychers were everywhere, feared and often hunted. But in those chaotic centuries, scattered faiths would have had every reason to seek out psychic insight. The last church might have trained its own sensitives. Quiet, disciplined minds able to resist corruption, not through force, but through purpose. Unlike imperial psychers, who are often broken and reassembled for service, these individuals would have been raised in structures of meaning. Their visions shaped by doctrine, their emotions grounded in belief. Some fans call them the Silent Choir, an unofficial name, obviously, but one that shows up again and again in speculative threads. Supposedly, these were low-level psychers trained not to speak, not to act, but to observe and hold. Not just data, but moments. They could walk through a battlefield and know which prayers had been whispered because the first shot was fired. They could look into the eyes of a soldier and see whether they had killed in anger or in grief. That kind of clarity wouldn't just make you a witness, it would make you terrifying. Compare that to the Imperium-sanctioned psychers, astropaths chained to void thrones, sanctioned seers whose visions are filtered through layers of bureaucratic paranoia. There's no trust in the warp anymore. Only control, only fear. If the eyes of the last church still exist as psychic beings, they represent a completely different relationship with the immaterium, one rooted in trust, discipline, and continuity, rather than domination. There's a theory that ties this idea directly to the black ships, that the eyes knew the ships would come one day, that the Emperor's network of psychic culling would sweep across the stars like a net. So they prepared. They taught their sensitive children to dim their presence, to cloud their signals, not by suppressing their powers entirely, but by reshaping them, turning broadcast into reception. They became psychic mirrors, not lanterns, always watching, never shining. A few scattered reports from inquisitorial sources, heavily redacted of course, describe interrogations gone wrong. Suspects with no clear background suddenly exhibiting memory manipulation or emotional shielding far beyond what their psychic profile would suggest. These aren't warp-touched madmen. These are calm, articulate individuals with one shared trait. They don't respond. They only reflect. No matter how much pressure is applied, they give nothing away. Some theorists argue these are sleeper eyes, trained to hold information not even they consciously understand until a certain condition is met. A phrase, a time, a place. The scarier possibility is that some of the eyes might not be fully human anymore. That in their attempts to merge faith with psychic clarity, they became something else, something that exists halfway between flesh and warp. Still rooted in humanity, but able to slip through the cracks. Maybe that's why the ruins feel like they remember. Maybe it's not the stone at all. Maybe it's something inside them, waiting, watching through the walls. There are old Mechanicus logs that speak of emotional feedback loops in ancient cathedra. structures that seem to respond to the mental state of those inside. One tech priest recorded the sensation of being gently repelled from a vault he was trying to enter, despite no physical force acting on him. His assistant described a dream the night before that warned her not to enter. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe something, still watches from the other side. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this theory. If the eyes of the last church were psychic, then they didn't just survive history. They transcended it. They don't need archives. They are the archives. Living repositories of the past, spread thin across the galaxy, hiding in plain sight, in basements, in ruins, in your neighbor's tired eyes. They wouldn't need to speak. They just need to see. And if they still do, maybe that's why we keep feeling like we're being watched. If there's one thing the Imperium hates more than Xenos or heretics, it's loose ends. And the eyes of the last church? They're the biggest, most unnerving loose end of all. Not because they challenge the Imperium with fire or rebellion, but because they exist in the gaps between data and myth, between memory and silence. And that's exactly the kind of thing the Inquisition was made to erase. We know the Inquisition goes after obvious threats, warp breaches, demonic cults, planetary sedition. But what really keeps them up at night are the quiet things. The things that don't scream in high Gothic or set hives on fire. Whispers, symbols, dreams that travel between people without ever being spoken aloud. And that's what the eyes represent, a memory the Imperium failed to kill, a ghost that still breathes. There are countless unofficial accounts spread like viral fragments across restricted data channels about inquisitors pursuing remnants of the last church. Some of them read like horror stories. Whole settlements purged because of a single carved spiral found under the chapel floor. A scribe flayed alive after transcribing a fragment of a prayer no one had heard in over 10,000 years. A planetary governor who disappeared after he tried to open a sealed vault beneath his capital's foundations, only for a replacement to be appointed overnight and all records of the incident to vanish. The classic example, the one everyone circles back to, is the so-called Echo trial. It's not in any sanctioned archive, but a few recovered Vox segments and memory etch fragments still circulate among the lore-obsessed. The story goes that a young psyker was brought before an inquisitorial tribunal after repeated incidents of non-codified religious expression. He didn't speak during the interrogation, just smiled and repeated one phrase, "The eye is open." Within 24 hours, the entire tribunal staff was reassigned and every record of the case scrubbed. The psyker? No one knows. Some say he was sent to Titan. Others think he walked out of the chamber and no one could stop him. It's hard not to feel the edges of paranoia when diving into these stories. You start noticing how many inquisitorial operatives suddenly develop gaps in their service records. How many worlds on the fringes have experienced unexplained spiritual realignments, followed by mass memory loss? How many archivists quietly go missing after submitting reports that include even indirect references to the last church? There's this theory among more radical lore hunters that the Ordo Hereticus has a blacklist, not of cults, not of individuals, but of concepts. Ideas so dangerous they're not meant to be fought, but forgotten. And the eyes of the last church is said to be one of them. Not because it poses a threat in the conventional sense, but because it introduces doubt. Doubt in the finality of the Emperor's cleansing. Doubt in the completeness of the imperial truth. Doubt that maybe, somewhere, the flame of the old world still flickers. It's not always direct persecution either. Sometimes it's sabotage. In one case, a research vessel from the Adeptus Mechanicus vanished after reporting anomalous psychic readings near the ruins of a pre-imperial sanctum. Another time, an ecclesiarchy cardinal ordered the demolition of a derelict basilica, only for his transport to detonate mid-flight, his last Vox record stating, "We are not meant to unbury this." Coincidence? Maybe, but at a certain point the pattern is too persistent to ignore. Some even believe that the Inquisition itself is split on the matter. That certain cells, especially within the Ordo Malleus or the more esoteric branches of the Ordo Xenos, don't want to destroy the eyes. They want to find them. Not out of reverence, but out of obsession. That they believe the eyes hold keys to pre-imperial knowledge, or even to psychic disciplines lost during the Age of Strife. that behind closed doors the Inquisition is at war with itself, some trying to wipe out the last echoes of faith, others trying to claim them. What's terrifying is the possibility that the eyes already know all of this, that they anticipated the response, that they counted on it. One fan theory says the Inquisition's very efforts to find and destroy them actually feed the network, forcing them deeper underground, making them more fluid, harder to trace. Like pruning a hydra only makes it smarter, less visible, more patient. It makes you wonder how many of the Inquisition's failures aren't really failures at all. How many times have they caught someone, only to realize too late they were looking at the wrong link in the chain? Or worse, the chain was looking back. Watching, learning. Because if the eyes really are still out there, then the war isn't over. It just changed shape. It became a battle between silence and control, between remembering and forgetting. And if the Inquisition has to hunt phantoms to preserve the illusion of certainty, then the phantoms are winning. If the eyes of the last church really do exist, and let's be honest, by this point in the rabbit hole, most of us are willing to believe they do, then the next terrifying question is, who else knows about them? Because in a galaxy full of ancient, cunning, and dangerously perceptive powers, it's hard to imagine humanity's oldest surviving secret hasn't caught someone else's attention. And that's where things get really weird. The theory that gets the most attention is that the Eldar knew about the eyes before the Imperium even formed. It makes a certain kind of sense. The Eldari were masters of psychic mapping, soul divination, and time-future probability long before mankind crawled out of its planetary grave. If anyone could recognize a human psychic network rooted in non-warp-based intuition and memory, it'd be them. Some fans believe the eyes and the seers of the Eldar might have even made contact at some point, either before or during the Age of Strife. Not as allies, but as observers recognizing observers. There's a striking theory that certain Eldar runes found on pre-Imperial artifacts actually translate to witness or echo. That they weren't left there by Eldar archaeologists, but as messages to the eyes, a sign that someone else was listening too. Then there's the stranger idea that certain craft worlds, particularly those with more reclusive tendencies like Ilkaith or obscure splinters of Yimlock, may have secretly respected the eyes, that they viewed them not as part of the Monkey plague, but as remnants of something purer, something closer to what the Eldar themselves had lost. The idea of faith without gods, of purpose without conquest, it resonates with some Eldar philosophies. There are even whispers that an Exodite enclave once protected a human ruin rumored to be tied to the last church, claiming it held memory worth preserving. No one's ever verified it, but that hasn't stopped the theory from spreading. Of course, if the Eldar might know, so might chaos. And this is where the tone shifts, because if the eyes are real, and if their existence has left a psychic imprint on humanity, even just a faint one, then the warp will know. It always does. The Immaterium isn't just a reflection of mortal minds. It's a predator that feeds on memory, belief, emotion. So what happens when a network of deeply trained psychic observers starts imprinting generations of silent remembrance into reality? Something not shaped by fear, greed, or rage, but by quiet clarity? Some argue that the Chaos Gods would hate the eyes for that very reason, that the eyes represent the one thing chaos can't easily feed on: discipline, order, stillness. They don't radiate the madness of cultists or the desperation of psychers calling for salvation. They radiate focus, intention, and that makes them dangerous in an entirely different way. Not vulnerable to corruption in the usual sense, because the eyes don't want power, they don't want worship, they just watch. And in the warp, that kind of presence might be seen as a threat. Then again, others take a darker view, that the eyes may have already been compromised, that in trying to see too far, to remember too deeply, they may have brushed against something they didn't understand. There's one haunting tale about a ruined chapel on a death world, sealed by inquisitorial order, where the walls bleed during psychic storms. The locals call it the Red Eye. Some believe it was once a temple of the last church. Others say it still is, but no longer serves the same faith. That whatever still speaks from within isn't memory anymore, it's hunger. And then there are the Xenos species we barely understand. The sloth, the hood, the rakghoul. Could they know of the eyes? Maybe not consciously, but psychically. Some fans speculate that the eyes operate on a wavelength not just hidden from the Imperium, but naturally attuned to species that exist in liminal states, shadows, entropy, decay. Creatures that feel more than they think. That the eyes might be engaged in some long, slow war of perception with beings most humans would call monsters. Or worse, that some of them are monsters now, twisted by millennia of hiding, waiting, absorbing everything. And here's the craziest angle I've come across. But it's one that keeps coming back to me. What if the eyes aren't just aware of these other powers, but have been using them? Not controlling them, not aligning with them, but maneuvering in the blind spots of attention. Letting the Imperium and chaos clash. Letting the Xenos stumble forward. All while they remain unseen, untouched, gathering what matters most. Understanding. Imagine a faction so patient, so subtle, it plays every side just to witness the outcome. Not to change the galaxy, but to make sure someone is there to remember it as it truly was. If that's what the eyes are doing. If they've outlived empires and gods and still walk among the stars in silence, untouched by the madness around them, then maybe they're not just relics. Maybe they're the last true power left in the galaxy. The ones who don't act, they endure, they see. And maybe, in the end, that's enough. Sometimes I catch myself staring at certain figures in the Imperium, the ones who seem just a bit too calm, too composed, too untouchable. And I start to wonder, what if they're not just powerful? What if they're watching? Not in the way an Inquisitor watches for heresy, or a Lord Commander watches over a crusade. I mean watching the way the eyes of the last church were said to watch. Quietly, without interference, without even being noticed unless they want to be. What if some of them never left? It's the kind of idea that starts as a joke and then slowly turns into an itch at the back of your mind. Because the longer you study Imperial history, the more you start noticing the odd gaps. People who rise through the ranks without explanation. Figures of influence who leave behind almost no personal records. Whole bloodlines in the noble houses that appear from nowhere with perfect lineage papers and just a mystery to be dismissed as aristocratic eccentricity. And every now and then, someone stumbles on a phrase or a symbol, buried in a footnote, carved into a piece of furniture, sewn into the hem of a robe, that doesn't match anything the Imperium recognizes, but does match what little we know of the eyes. There's a fan theory that one of the High Lords of Terra is a descendant of the last church. Not directly, not with bloodlines you could trace on paper, but through inheritance of purpose. The theory doesn't name names, because no one dares to. But the story goes that this figure protects old records, that they vetoed multiple exterminatus orders against planets suspected of harboring pre-imperial ruins, that they've influenced ecclesiarchal doctrine from the shadows to keep certain hymns from ever being rediscovered. More grounded theories point to members of the Administratum or the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, places where information control is absolute and where someone with the right training could disappear into the bureaucracy for centuries. There are rumors of senior archivists who've been in their position far longer than their supposed age would suggest. Or adepts who speak in perfect binaric but still carry around prayer tokens with no identifiable creed. You'd think the Inquisition would catch that. But maybe they've tried. And maybe that's why some Inquisitors go silent after certain investigations. There's also the idea that the eyes didn't just survive by hiding among the powerful, but by becoming essential to them. That over time, they offered their services as discreet advisors, fixers, planners, never making themselves known, but always ensuring a certain outcome. Some call them the Grey Stewards, agents who serve not one master, but the memory of a forgotten truth. You'll find them standing behind planetary governors, whispering in the ears of sector lords, or sitting silently on advisory councils, always present, never leading, but steering. One story that's always stuck with me is about a rogue trader who discovered a sealed tomb on a dead world outside known imperial borders. Inside, he found a library, fully intact, untouched by time or decay, filled with handwritten volumes in a dialect no lex mechanic could translate. He brought a few books back, only to find himself visited within days by a soft-spoken envoy from the Administratum who thanked him for his service and took the books away. The envoy was never logged, never recorded, and never seen again. The rogue trader's vessel was reassigned, his crew disbanded, and he died in his sleep. No signs of violence. Just silence. Like someone had closed the file. It's the subtle things that feed the paranoia. The way some tech priests avert their eyes when you mention certain relic patterns. The way some ecclesiarchy sermons suddenly change tone when older hymns are requested. The fact that no one can agree on what the last church's symbol actually looked like, yet everyone who hears the phrase seems to feel like they've seen it before. Maybe in a dream, maybe in a memory they don't remember making. And there are stranger accounts. Stories of voidfarers who, when lost in deep space, report being rescued not by other ships, but by vessels with no insignia, no broadcast signature, and crews who speak perfect low Gothic but vanish after rendering aid. These ships never appear on Auspex logs. They don't fire weapons. They don't engage. They just arrive, observe, and disappear. Some say these are ships operated by the eyes. Others think they're just hallucinations. But the pattern is too consistent to ignore. The truth is, if the eyes still walk among us, they wouldn't announce themselves. They wouldn't wear symbols or chant prayers. They would blend. They would watch. They would whisper the right words to the right people at the right time to make sure the past isn't forgotten, even if no one remembers why it matters. And maybe that's their power. Not in armies or miracles, but in continuity. In being present. In surviving where everyone else fades away. Because what if we're not dealing with a remnant anymore? What if the eyes adapted? What if they evolved into something the Imperium could never fully eliminate? Not because they're stronger, but because they're quieter. Not ghosts, not rebels, but something else entirely. Something that's still here. Still watching, still waiting. There's something profoundly haunting about these kinds of stories. Not because they scream or rage, but because they whisper. Because they reach across the millennia with the softness of memory, not the violence of war. The eyes of the last church aren't a confirmed faction or a codex entry. They're a feeling, a presence, a shadow on the wall that vanishes when you turn to look. And maybe that's what makes them so powerful. They live in the absence, in what's missing, in what was deliberately forgotten. It's easy to forget, in the endless brutality of the Warhammer universe, that there was once a time before the Imperium. A time when humanity still searched for meaning rather than control. The last church, whether it was a singular institution or a fragmented network of surviving belief, represents a version of mankind that wasn't trying to conquer the galaxy, but to understand it. And the idea that something of that survived the Emperor's cleansing, that it slipped past the fire and the blade and continued to exist in silence, that's terrifying and kind of beautiful. Because if it's true, if the eyes still walk among us, it means the story of humanity isn't just one of oppression and survival. It's one of endurance, of memory, of faith in something deeper than doctrine or dogma. Something older than even the warp itself, the will to remember. That's what the eyes represent. Not rebellion, not salvation, just remembrance, pure and unshakable. And I think that's why the Inquisition fears them more than it fears demons. Because the eyes don't challenge the Imperium with force. They challenge it with doubt. With the quiet, poisonous question, what if the truth didn't burn away with the cathedrals? What if it just closed its eyes and waited? This story, this theory, this possibility, it sticks with you. It lingers. Every time you walk past a forgotten archive, every time you see a robed figure standing a little too still in the background of a picked capture, you start to wonder. Not, are they dangerous? But what do they remember that I don't? That's what makes it so compelling. It's not about fear, it's about mystery, and the possibility that someone, somewhere, still carries the soul of humanity's lost age in their chest like a dying ember. And maybe that ember's not dying at all. So I guess the real question is this. What if it's true? What if the eyes of the last church were never a myth? What if they're still here, right now, listening, observing, preserving the old truths in the places we're told never to look? And if they are, what else have they seen? That's where I want to leave it, with the open door. The space for your theories, your interpretations, your gut feelings. Have you seen traces of them in the lore? Have you felt like certain figures were just too knowing to be what they claimed? Or maybe you have your own take? Something I missed? something even deeper. That's what I love about these stories. They're not finished, they breathe, and we're part of them just by remembering. So if you've made it this far, thank you. You've walked with me through myths and shadows, through silence and fire, and maybe, just maybe, through a sliver of forgotten truth. If that journey meant something to you, consider subscribing. It helps keep the search going. Drop a comment, share your own theory. Tell me who you think the eyes are, or whether they were ever real to begin with. Because in this grimdark galaxy where the past is always burning, sometimes the most radical act is to remember. And sometimes, remembering is enough to shake the stars.